I'm Leo Franck. I'm a history major, and I will be graduating May of 26.
Oh, so what was Summer Scholars? What was your first introduction to it?
So my first introduction to it was learning about it through a friend who did it last summer. My friend Isabel did Summer Scholars last summer, and again this summer, so that was very fun for us to do it together. And I had, the previous year, my sophomore year, realized I love doing research projects in history. I had done one for my History of Modern China class, and I was so proud of that paper. It was amazing. I'm still proud of the title. It was a quotation from one of my primary sources that teachers were the invisible knives in the back of society, and it was just such a cool, like, I loved working with the primary sources and doing analysis. So then when I knew that what Isabel had done with Summer Scholars, and I thought that seems like so much fun, I want to do that. I love doing research, and it's the perfect opportunity to do it. Yeah. And especially with the amount of time you get to dedicate it to it. It is your full-time job for the summer to do research, and that was just so, like, it was like a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow to me. My project, it really started in the spring semester when I was taking the American History Part 2 survey that's required for the history major. And we had to do a research project, and I was having trouble picking a topic, so Dr. Carlson recommended I look into the UDHR, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was passed by the United Nations in 1948. And he said to specifically look at Eleanor Roosevelt because she was the chair of the commission. So I wrote 2 papers on that last semester, a primary source analysis and a research paper. And as I was doing all of it, I kind of had Summer Scholars in the back of my mind. And then Dr. Carlson forwarded me an email about it. So then I was like, I'm 100% doing this.
Yeah.
So then I put my proposal together. My initial research project had looked at what did Eleanor Roosevelt see as the purpose of this document? Reading she wrote a weekly, 6-day-a-week newspaper column in a women's magazine, looking at those primary sources, her speeches, reading her autobiography, and what did she want? What did she see this document at the purpose of it being? And that was my first question I answered in research. And then I had a further question, which is, how did the Holocaust influence the creation of this document? Because it was made in the aftermath of it. She spent one of her responsibilities on the drafting committee. Part of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations was to go to these displaced persons camps where refugees were, and there were some specific displaced persons camps for Holocaust survivors. And so I know that she interacted with survivors directly, and I wanted to know how those experiences influenced her work on the commission. And that's where my research proposal came out of for Summer Scholars.
Why was Eleanor Roosevelt your main topic? I mean, there was a lot of other important people around that time.
Yeah, I think because she was the chair of this commission, and that's where I started. And it's much easier to start from a U.S. perspective because the drafting committee had representatives from all around the world, and she was the American representative on the committee. So a lot more, first, access to primary sources for Eleanor Roosevelt is very abundant. So that made things an easy place to get in. And then I've kind of always had an admiration for the Roosevelts. Okay. I've read a couple books about them, and they've always been like a smaller scale fascination with me in history.
So tell me a little bit about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
So after World War II, the United Nations was created during the war, and then it became like an official entity afterwards. And they decided, looking at the aftermath of everything that had happened, that the world needed, and the official prompt they were given was an international Bill of Rights. So something to be, these are our shared values, this is what we as the United Nations are working towards. And after 2 years of work, that became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A committee was formed to draft up this declaration to be given to the wider UN to vote on. And it took them a couple years of a lot of sometimes very heated argument because it seems like such an obvious thing, but it's there's so much more nuance to it on why agreeing on 30 universal provisions of rights are very, very difficult across so many different cultures. They're, especially during the early years of Cold War tensions. A lot of what Eleanor's role on the commission was to kind of keep heads cool between some of these almost warring superpowers.
Yeah.
And so the UDHR was created after the Second World War to keep something from like that, to keep something like that from happening again. And it's very important to note that it isn't necessarily binding law. International law gets very murky. Something I've learned is that international law isn't as real as I thought it was, real in its ability to bind people to their commitments. But it's sort of an agreement of these are what the things we aspire to be. This is what we think a world of peace and prosperity and acting in kindness with our fellow man will look like.
Okay.
So the first provision is that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And that is the guiding principle of the UDHR, is to uphold that freeness that we all are born with inherently. So I was just at last week this conference called the Anne Frank International Youth Network Conference.
Okay.
And the idea is the Anne Frank House has an official U.S. partner at the University of South Carolina, which has a traveling exhibit that Capital recently hosted. So several of us from Capital were, by doing that, qualified to apply to go to this international conference in Columbia, South Carolina. And I was just there this past week. And this week's theme, this year's theme was democracy and human rights.
Okay.
So very topical. And we did this activity as part of one of our workshops where we were given rights, and we were told to order them, which we thought was the most important to the least important.
Okay.
And we were in groups of about 4, and my group had an American, 2 Polish people, and a person from Panama. And we all had such different opinions on what should go where based on the struggles that were happening in our own countries at the moment, except for the first one, which the first right every single group picked was almost verbatim from the UDHR, which made me very excited. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity. And I think that, again, we were all saying, I think the right to vote comes here because that hasn't always been guaranteed in my country. But other people would say, no, the right to protest needs to come before the right to vote, because if we aren't out there demanding our rights be protected, we might not be able to protect this right. So I think that still human rights are very much a debate and not agreed upon, and not necessarily just the order, but the fact that we are allowed to have them is still we're still very, I don't want to say lucky, but I think not enough people appreciate just how tenuous our freedoms are, especially in today's world as things are being turned on their heads constantly. And the UDHR isn't necessarily the preeminent international human rights treaty anymore. There have been several subsequent treaties. The Geneva Conventions, the laws of war we're supposed to abide by, not torturing, not submitting people to torture. And then in the 90s, after the collapse of the USSR, the Vienna Convention was signed and agreed upon, which kind of superseded the UDHR. But the UDHR is still considered by many scholars to be the foundational layer of the current human rights regime. And human rights regime here means the combination of international bodies like the UN, the International Court of Justice, sovereign states and governments agreeing to uphold those, and non-governmental entities that promote human rights and try to uplift people. And the thing to remember is that all of these organizations, groups, governments don't always agree on what exactly upholding human rights means. So the cards they gave us that had the rights on one side, we then flipped over in the next half of the exercise, and it had real world examples of when those rights were violated. And we were then told to reorder once we saw the real life consequences of not having those rights. And I think that was a very important exercise for me to do after spending I suppose, 7 months reading about human rights on an intellectual level, on like just a scholarly level. It was very important because sometimes I just get so into the nuance and some of the philosophies of the argument that it's very easy to get away from the real world consequences of what these words on a piece of paper mean.
Yeah.
So I think that's something going forward in my work, and the more research I want to do into this topic, I think I need to keep as my touchstone is what are these real world consequences.
Where do you stand on that working thesis?
My current thesis is much more evolved, and I think I've gone more big picture because the thesis I ended up with is that the UDHR itself is the world's response to fascism, to Nazism, in saying, no, we disagree with everything that stands for, and here in paper, agreed upon unanimously by the United Nations, antithesis to Nazism, which is the UDHR. So my final thesis is that the UDHR is a complete rebuke of the horrors of World War II and an agreement by the world to be better.
What did your summer look like, and what support did you receive?
So throughout the summer, I started with a literature review, looking at what are like the main scholars in this field of human rights history saying about the influence that the Holocaust had on the UDHR. And I thought I was going to get through the literature review in maybe a week or two, but it wound up taking me a month.
Okay. A little bit different.
Yeah, big difference there. Until I read one book by that author I mentioned previously, Johannes Morsink. He seems to be like the expert on the Holocaust and the UDHR, that connection. And I read his book and I thought he gives so much evidence from the meeting minutes of the drafting committee. And in those minutes, in those meetings, delegates are saying, the Nazis did this, so we need to do this to prevent it. Like, we need to have this article in the UDHR because the Nazis did this. So that is, to me, very clear evidence. So once I had completed that literature review, I then shifted to looking at primary sources. I was able to look at UN documents, writings by Eleanor Roosevelt, because she was still my touchstone. I wanted to look at it from her perspective. But even communicating via email with the FDR library, and they were sending me some things they were able to get me scans of.
Cool. Yeah.
It was very cool. I wasn't able to find much of Eleanor talking about the Holocaust, the influence that the Holocaust had in her work. So I was kind of like, did I just waste all these months? And then I was told by my advisors, look other places, don't get so bogged down in just this primary source. So I decided to start looking at some of the other delegates, especially the ones that were mentioned by Morsink in his work. And I started focusing on the French delegate, René Cassin. He had served in World War I, and he was of Jewish ancestry and had lost 21 relatives in the Holocaust, which is actually a low number for a lot of people who survive. Otto Frank lost, I believe it was 56 relatives, almost his entire family. So looking at René Cassin's work, I was able to then come to the conclusion, okay, it's a delegate by delegate basis of who is more focused on the effects of the Holocaust and preventing it again.
Yeah.
So I was able to really deepen my analysis by expanding from Eleanor. And then once I had done about a month of the lit review, about a little less than a month of the dealing with the primary sources, just taking notes and notes and notes, I started writing. And those first 2 pages, I had never spent so long trying to write something because there was so much information to synthesize, and this has been so different than anything I've done for a class, because this is weeks and weeks of full-time research, reading. I feel like I can see just footnotes in my mind when I go to sleep. There's so much of it, and now I'm sitting at about 15 pages of writing. Probably going to get in a few more this week, and then I'm adding in some images within the document because I discussed some propaganda images used by the Nazis and some American cartoons as well. Part of the brief of Summer Scholars is they want us to publish, to continue to share our work. So the main one where they want us to be presenting is at Capitol Spring Symposium, which I'm very excited about. I presented my previous papers on the UDHR at the symposium last spring, and it's been very exciting. I did symposium the year before, but I just did a poster, and I enjoy the oral presentations much more because I get to talk more. I get to show off what I know more. And so I'm very excited for that. And then we're also, I'm planning on submitting to NCUR, National Undergraduate Research Conference, which I believe happens in February, but the submission deadlines are in November. And then I'm also submitting to the History Honors Society, the Phi Alpha Theta paper. They have an undergraduate research paper. The Columbus libraries are hosting a Americans in the Holocaust exhibit next winter. And Capitol Libraries, there's been some rumblings about trying to work with them and co-host some programming. And I was hoping to talk to the librarians and see if I can present my paper here on Capitol for that sort of event. And then also, the Anthrax Youth Network has a podcast, and they have a submission form for something cool you want to talk about on the podcast. I was going to submit my project for that to continue to spread it even more.
Okay.
And then, of course, I want to use it for grad school application.